Thank you so much. Good evening. I'm delighted to be here alongside our Canadian ministers in this the seventh JEFA Assembly. Today, delegates from 186 countries took a historical decision just 8 months after the historic achievement that was generated in the CBD COP15 last December in Montreal with regards to the establishment of a new fund, a new facility within the Global Environment Facility. This new fund is aimed to support the strategic implementation of this very ambitious set of 23 global targets for biodiversity conservation. The objectives of this framework is to really preserve and conserve biodiversity along the planet with a ambitious target by 2030 of protecting 30% of the ocean and 30% of the land. At the same time that we commit to generate sustainable activities regarding the use of wild and domestic biodiversity. At the same time that we set another set of very interesting and nevertheless very ambitious targets with regards to resource mobilization. There's a commitment by parties to mobilize from all sources by 2030 $200 billion. It's not an easy task, but everything begins with this effort. And also very importantly, as what it means to mobilize $200 billion from all sources, all countries. This is primarily a mobilization of domestic resources, whereby public fiscal resources are extremely important, but at the domestic level, the mobilization of private sector and philanthropic are key into that. There's another high expectation of this new framework that has to do with what I call policy coherence. No country is immune to the fact that our development policies promote private and public investment that contributes to climate change and the loss of biodiversity. So we need to phase out those perverse incentives and move from negative incentives into positive ones. And the last but not least, the role of non-state actors, in particular indigenous communities, local communities, youth and women, are in the center of this. This new facility within the JEF looks to increase the strategic financial support to all the members of the CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity, but for the first time, there will be funds channeled to non-state actors as civil society is key in this global effort to mobilize resources and implement actions that help us be on track with this longer-term aspiration of being nature positive. Myself, as CEO of the Global Environment Facility, I would really like to recognize the leadership of the Government of Canada and the people of Canada in being able to be where we are. In less than 1 year after the COP, we will be having the first council meeting, and probably in 1.5 years, we'll have the first disbursement of financial resources, which is a record. Any way you see it, is a record with regards to establishing a multilateral mechanism that mobilizes resources at the scale, at the global scale. We're talking about 180 to 190 countries. I'm very, very happy with what happened today and the last few months. And well, what a great place, the JEF Assembly, to consummate something that began in Montreal 8 months ago. Thank you so much.
Bonjour et merci de votre présence aujourd'hui. La biodiversité ne se limitait pas à la beauté et au merveilleux de la nature. Elle est un fondement essentiel de notre bien-être et de la santé de notre planète. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. I'm very pleased to be here with Manuel Rodríguez, who's the chair of the Global Environment Facility, as well as my friend and colleague, Minister Steven Guilbeault, Canada's Minister of Environment and Climate Change. Biodiversity is not just the beauty and wonder of nature. It is critical. It is a critical foundation for our well-being as human beings and the health of our planet. And everyone here understands that biodiversity and associated ecosystems are invaluable for our present and future. They underpin human health, well-being, and economic growth. Our very survival is woven into this complex tapestry. But global biodiversity loss is at critical levels, and this affects the threads of all systems, whether social or economic. And while Canada is home to significant biodiversity and natural areas, the vast majority of the world's biodiversity is outside of our borders, in particular in tropical countries. That is why action is needed on this front in all parts of the world, not just in one part of the world. And this is the work that we all have to do to challenge biodiversity loss. Halting and reversing biodiversity loss requires real collaboration. It requires partnerships. It also requires innovation. We also need a proper accounting for the true value of nature in decision-making across all sectors. That is something that I think there's a lot of room to grow on that scale. Last December, delegates from around the world gathered in Montreal and agreed on the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And I really want to once again highlight the able work of Minister Guilbeault in reaching that agreement and really creating the environment for the entire world to come together in Montreal to reach this framework agreement. It is the most ambitious global agreement on biodiversity in the history of environmental governance. And it will serve as the world's framework for actions taken at all levels to safeguard and restore biodiversity. And this is extremely essential because the importance of not only halting the loss of biodiversity, but restoring it is something that we all should take very seriously. I'm very excited to report that the Global Environment Facility Assembly has collectively agreed to ratify the new Global Biodiversity Framework Fund at the 7th GEF Assembly. This important fund highlights three critical innovations. I spoke about the importance of innovation earlier. First, for the first time ever, we agreed to allocate 20% of the fund towards Indigenous-led initiatives to protect and conserve biodiversity. Second, we agreed to deliver 25% of the funds through international financial institutions. This is a key way to pull more resources through the private sector, leveraging their involvement and making sure policies are coherent. And third, the new fund will prioritize support for the most vulnerable, small island developing states, as well as least developed countries. And we noted in the Assembly that these are the countries that are experiencing the biggest impacts of biodiversity loss and climate change, yet have contributed the least to those effects. They will receive 36% of the resources plus an additional 3% of the funds if they have the capacity to take it up. Developing countries across all geographical regions need support to deliver on the 23 targets under the Global Biodiversity Framework. Targets like conservation, restoration, protection against invasive species. This is really important work, and this fund will empower them to do the important work that we need to be done in every region around the world. And that is why, following today's ratification, I'm really pleased to join my colleague, Minister Guilbeault, to announce that Canada will commit an initial seed funding of $200 million to the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund. I'm also announcing an additional $22.8 million to the GEF's 8th replenishment to provide further support for the efforts of GEF to tackle the triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. At COP15, we announced $219 million to the 8th replenishment. This builds on that commitment. And so the new Global Biodiversity Framework will play a key role in addressing biodiversity loss. It will address biodiversity loss in developing countries. It will do so in a gender-responsive manner. It will do so in a way that cuts across different sectors and is inclusive of Indigenous peoples. And the fund will quickly mobilize and disperse new resources and seek out new partners and take action to help and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. Car nous devons tous être les gardiens de ce précieux patrimoine naturel et assurer sa protection pour les générations à venir. Because we must all steward this precious natural heritage and protect it for generations to come. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Cher Ahmed, chers collègues, merci beaucoup. And thank you so much for stepping in, I'd say even jumping in your new role so quickly and being here with us. Carlos, it's a pleasure to be here with you. Congratulations to you and your team for the extraordinary speed at which you've moved on this COP15 commitment to create a new fund under the GEF. I was sort of half joking to someone earlier that if we tried to do that domestically, to have a new fund up and running and dispersing money within about 2 years, we would be challenged to do that. Imagine doing it on the global scale, and that's exactly what you're doing. I'm happy to join you here on the traditional homelands of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. It seems very fitting that we are here in beautiful Vancouver for the Global Environment Facility's 7th Assembly. British Columbia bears witness to the tremendous collaboration today. Le monde vit une crise de la biodiversité sans précédent. En même temps que la crise climatique, une crise qui augmente les feux de forêt dévastateurs que l'on observe au Canada et dans le monde entier. Les populations d'animaux sauvages ont diminué de 70% dans les 50 dernières années. Plus d'1 million d'espèces sont menacées d'extinction, y compris plus de 650 espèces en péril au Canada. Et cette situation est très préoccupante puisque chaque espèce est essentielle à l'écosystème où elle vit, et que les écosystèmes sains sont essentiels et sont notre meilleur allié dans la lutte contre les changements climatiques. It's critical that we accelerate global action to reach our biodiversity targets by 2030. And for that, we need to support ambitious mobilization of resources. Canada is home to a quarter of the world's boreal forest, a quarter of the world's temperate forest, and a quarter of the world's wetland. We have the world's longest coastline, 2 million lakes, and the third largest area of glaciers in the world. So Canada is committed to doing our part. And that's why Canada is deeply committed to the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework and its ambitious finance target. That profound sense of accomplishment we achieved last December in Montreal, that sense of common global success must carry us forward for the long implementation years to come, because this is a generational battle. I want to thank my counterparts and all partners involved in negotiations for showing such an outstanding spirit of global collaboration in this moment of crisis. Thanks to everyone's determination and active participation, we've established a new Global Biodiversity Framework Fund, or the GBF Fund, in record time. And this is critical so that developing countries and Indigenous peoples can access funding and implement their goals. We're also thankful to the Global Environment Facility for making such smooth, effective collaboration possible. Canada is a long-standing contributor of the GEF. We have achieved so much through the years. Over the past 3 decades, the Global Environment Facility has supported developing countries in programming aimed to establish marine protected areas, as well as terrestrial protected areas larger than the size of Brazil. It is helping to protect black rhinos in South Africa, mangrove forests on India's east coast, and coral reefs in the Red Sea. I'm confident that the GBF Fund will be a key factor in the global goal to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. With this new $200 million investment, Canada steps up as the first country to make a public pledge to the GBF Fund. This is the start of a long climb. We will keep working with our international partners to mobilize $20 billion per year by 2025, and $30 billion by 2030 in financial resources for biodiversity for developing countries, as well as an overall goal of mobilizing from all sources $200 billion by 2030. Mais nous ne pouvons y parvenir seuls. Nous encourageons les gouvernements, le secteur privé, les organisations philanthropiques et d'autres contributeurs à se mobiliser et à soutenir immédiatement le fonds associé au cadre mondial de la biodiversité de Kunming-Montréal. Il en va de l'intérêt de tous ceux qui vivent sur cette planète. Ce fonds constitue un mécanisme de financement ainsi que des engagements financiers, mais il représente aussi nos aspirations quant à l'avenir de la biodiversité. N'oublions pas, en tant qu'humains, nous faisons partie de cette biodiversité et nous en dépendons entièrement. Agir pour restaurer les écosystèmes dégradés, sauver les espèces menacées et assurer la résilience de notre planète. C'est agir pour assurer notre propre avenir en tant qu'espèce. Merci. C'est avec plaisir maintenant qu'on répondra à vos questions.
Merci bien à vous tous. Thank you so much. We now have time, as I mentioned, for 2 questions plus 2 follow-ups. We're going to start with Canadian media and followed by a question from international media. And I would highly encourage everyone to focus on the activities of the week here at the Jeff 7th Assembly and on the GBF fund that has just been announced. Thank you. I understand that we have a first question from CTV.
This question is for Minister Guilbeault. This is from my co-worker, CTV National News. Do you agree with Japan's decision to dump 1.34 million tons of treated radioactive water into the Pacific Ocean?
This is actually an issue that was discussed during the last G7 Environment Ministers meeting in Japan, and we have told the Japanese government that the government of Canada had some concern. I know that the International Nuclear Agency has stated that the levels at which the water would be released are within safe limits. But I think we remain, and I think a lot of people remain concerned, and we will continue engaging with the Japanese government on this issue.
The environment groups are actually stating that there is some environmental impact. So what kind of impact could this have on marine life and Canadians living along the Pacific coast?
As I said, and I have seen a declaration from many environmental organizations, as I stated, the International Nuclear Safety Organization has stated that they have done some testing, and in their view, the amount of radioactive water that will be released is within safe limits. That doesn't mean that we will not continue to monitor the situation and engage proactively with the Japanese government on this issue.
Great, thank you. Turn it over. Please, please go to the microphone.
Hi, this question is for Carlos Manuel, please.
Can you introduce yourself and your
Of course, just wanted to give him that opportunity. Gregory Scruggs with DevX. In light of the $200 million pledge today from Canada, the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund can now be institutionalized at the World Bank. What are your expectations for additional pledges from other donor countries, philanthropies, private sector by COP16 next year? Do you have a target in mind, and how do you intend to get there?
Well, at this point, our basic target for this year is $200 million US, so we can set up, as you said, within the World Bank. Nevertheless, we look for 2024 as a year for the capitalization of the fund. Many of the main donors to the GEF has responded in a very positive manner, explaining that there's this fiscal cycle that they need to comply with. As a matter of fact, it's ironic that we were able to put the fund in place even before the donor nations go through their internal domestic fiscal processes. They need to go to Congresses and budget and Minister of Finance.
We anticipated you would be that quick, which is why Canada...
So this is what is happening at this point. I think that it is extremely important that the first GBFF Council meeting will happen next January. And most probably the first disbursements will happen in June 2024, when we have the second GBFF Council meeting. We'll probably have 2 per year. By then, I really believe that the donors will concrete their pledges, and this is part of the context of what was agreed in Montreal with regards to the fact that countries will double their flow of resources by 2025. So 2024 is kind of the stepping stone process into achieving that. I see that most probably will be fulfilling, that donors will be fulfilling the 2025 deadline before the end of 2025, which are great and wonderful news. So everything goes quite well. And next year, with the first GBFF council meeting, we'll be in a capitalization mode. And I think that this will go according to the recipient countries' expectations and donors' expectations as well.
And as a follow-up, in light of the fund's pillar prioritizing the most vulnerable, least developed countries and small and developing states, how will you ensure that having an additional fund will not simply generate more paperwork, more demands on strapped, undercapacitated?
That's a very good question.
Yeah, as opposed to keeping it in the fund.
That's a very good question. The GPFF is a fund that will be complementing what the GEF does. And what the GEF does is responding to 6 international environmental conventions, being one, the Convention on Biological Diversity. So it will be a complement adding value to that process. So that is kind of the real context. As we put together the programming proposal, I mean, how to distribute resources, we came up with a great idea, which is assessing a new project cycle based on what we have in place with the GEF Trust Fund. So the GBFF will have a streamlined GEF project cycle that we will be looking very closely, because what we do there will help us streamlining on the main big funds that the GEF does has. This requires investing in more capacities, particularly in less developed countries, small island developing states, that sometimes they don't have the capacity to absorb the GEF resources. So we see investments that has to do with building those capacities so we can be more efficient and we can deal in a better way with these concerns of recipient countries with regards to access to finance. Access to finance is not necessarily bureaucratic regulations on the side of the GEF. We got regulations that has to do with the quality of the project, that has to do with the fiduciary responsibilities of the project, and the safeguards, very important safeguards. Nevertheless, access to finance was something that was brought to our attention during the COP15 in Montreal, and it is embedded in what we're doing here. So in a sense, we're testing new processes and new approaches in these new funds that will eventually trickle up into the big funds that we have at the GEF.
Great, thank you so much. This concludes our press conference. I'm now going to invite media who would like to take pictures, as well as our official photographers, to make their way to the adjoining room, escorted by my colleague Pierre at the back, and we'll have the ministers as well as Minister Rodriguez follow shortly.